We go now to John Lauro, one of former President Trump's lawyers. He joins us now from New York. John, good morning to you. I want to let you know that we spoke with former Vice President Mike Pence and asked him specifically about your assertions made this last week that all the president did was asked him to pause the certification on January 6, 2021. He told me flatly, quote, "That's not what happened." Your response?
That's not what I said, though, but that's okay.
What is it that you believe happened between the president and the vice president? And do you have any fear of the vice president being called as a witness in the case?
No. In fact, the vice president will be our best witness. What I said is the ultimate ask of Vice President Pence was to pause the count and allow the states to weigh in. That was my statement. And what I've said is consistent with what Vice President Pence is saying. The reason why Vice President Pence will be so important to the defense is the following. Number one, he agrees that John Eastman, who gave legal advice to President Trump, was an esteemed legal scholar. Number two, he agrees that there were election irregularities, fraud, unlawful actions at the state level. All of that will eviscerate any allegation of criminal intent on the part of President Trump. And finally, what Vice President Pence believes and believed is that these issues needed to be debated on January 6th. He openly called for all of these issues to be debated and objected to in the January 6th proceeding. President Trump, on the other hand, believed, following the advice of John Eastman, who's a legal scholar, that these issues needed to be debated at the state level, not the federal level. Now, of course, there was a constitutional disagreement between Vice President Pence and President Trump, but the bottom line is never in our country's history has those kinds of disagreements been prosecuted criminally. It's unheard of.
John, can I ask you a couple of very simple, basic yes or no questions? Is there any condition under which the former President of the United States, your client, would accept a plea deal on these January 6th charges?
No.
Will you seek a motion to dismiss?
Absolutely, 100%.
When?
100%. Well, within the time permitted. This is what's called a Swiss cheese indictment. It has so many holes that we're going to be identifying and litigating a number of motions that we're going to file on First Amendment grounds, on the fact that President Trump is immune as president from being prosecuted in this way.
Do you have a ballpark figure of when you'd be ready for trial?
Well, I can tell you that in 40 years of practicing law, on a case of this magnitude, I've not known a single case to go to trial before 2 or 3 years.
Understood. Are you still going to pursue a change of venue?
Absolutely. We would like a diverse venue, a diverse jury.
Do you have any expectation that will be granted?
That reflects the characteristics of the American people. It's up to the judge. I think West Virginia would be an excellent venue to try this case.
Speaking of the judge,
very close to D.C. and a much more diverse.
Understood. Speaking of the judge, earlier this week, your client, the former president, said on his social media platform the judge is unfair. On what basis did he say that?
Well, the problem with bringing a case like this in the middle of a campaign season is statements are going to be made in the context of a campaign. We expect a fair and just trial in the District of Columbia, and my role is simply to ensure that President Trump's rights, just like every American's rights, are protected every step of the way, and I'm going to do that.
You mentioned discovery. In the protective order back and forth between you and the prosecutors, it says, the prosecution, that discovery will be provided, quote, as soon as possible, including certain discovery to which the defendant is not entitled. What's wrong with that?
We're all in favor of protecting sensitive and highly sensitive information, but it's unprecedented to have all information hidden in a criminal case, including, by the way, information that might be exculpatory and might be exonerative of President Trump. The Biden administration wants to keep that information from the American people.
John, in the back and forth on this matter, you also said in a filing to the court that the former president would be willing to come to an agreement on this matter. And what I ask you is, would that requirement be something where the president would agree not to release any information that was highly sensitive in this matter? And would he also refrain from any speech that called for or hinted at retribution about anyone associated with the prosecution of this case?
He's never called for that at all. He's going to abide by the conditions of his release. But of course, we would agree that any sensitive or highly sensitive information be kept under wraps. In fact, we made that proposition to the Biden administration, but they rejected it. They want every single piece of evidence in this case hidden from the American public.
John, before I let you go, do you remember what you were doing the early morning of November 9th, 2016?
I have no idea.
Well, I remember what I was doing. I was covering President-elect Trump announcing that he had won the presidency about 3 a.m. that morning after the November 8th election. My question to you, John, is how did he know he won?
Well, politicians are convinced in the righteousness of their cause, including President Trump, and he certainly believed that he won.
But on what basis did he know he won? But on what basis did he know he won?
Can I finish? Can I finish?
Sure.
Can I finish? And he believed in 2020 that he won based on the fact that he had 10 million more votes than in 2016. He had a situation where somehow President Biden, or at that time candidate Biden, received 15 million more votes than Hillary Clinton. And he also understood in 2020 that President Trump understood that he had won virtually all of the bellwether counties and 84% of all the counties in the country.
John, let me
help
you with this.
That he was successful.
John, let me help you with this. I wasn't asking about 2020.
No, let me help you with this because
I wasn't asking about 2020, John. John, I wasn't asking about 2020. I was asking about 2016.
Right.
Because the votes were still being counted in 2016. The votes were still being counted in 2016. There had been no recounts. How did he know in 2016 that he had won? How did he know? On what basis?
The issue, let me just tell you something. The issue in this criminal case is not what happened in 2016 and whether all candidates say they won. The issue now is in 2020 whether or not the Justice Department can weaponize criminal law to go after a political opponent and prevent that opponent from running for office. That's the issue, not what happened in 2016.
John Lauro, we thank you for your time.
Do you think it's fair what the Biden administration is doing to a candidate for president?
John Lauro, we thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we will be right back. Welcome back. We turn now to Minnesota Democratic Congressman Dean Phillips, who might, in fact, be able to answer a question he's given some energy to. Are you going to run for president against Joe Biden?
Well, Major, I have not decided yet, but I will tell you why I'm here. And I lost my dad in Vietnam in 1969, lived with my great-grandparents for 2.5 years. My mom was 24 and widowed. Was adopted when I was 3 by an extraordinary dad into a remarkable family. I know a little something about living on both sides of advantage. And I woke up the morning after the 2016 election, the one you just spoke about, saw fear in my daughter's eyes, my 2 daughters. I recognized at that moment that millions of Americans have had that same fear for generations. And I promised them I would do something. I ran for Congress. And I ran a campaign that was about everybody being invited. That was my slogan. I listened to Democrats, Republicans, independents, and I discovered that everybody wants the same thing. Everybody. We want to be safe. We want to have security, both economic and otherwise. We want opportunity, and we want unity. Serving our country in Congress has been a joy. I know you don't hear that too often. It has been a joy. And I've discovered that everybody in the middle, the massive majority of Americans, are sick of angertainment, telling us we're more divided than we really are. They're sick of members of Congress, state houses, attacking each other instead of attacking problems. They want their families back, their friendships back, their communities back. They want unity. And I want to give voice to them. And then secondly, I want to give voice to Democrats. I'm a lifelong, passionate Democrat, inspired by Hubert Humphrey and Martin Luther King. Democrats are telling me that they want not a coronation, but they want a competition. The New York Times poll from this week shows 55% of Democratic voters want some alternatives to the current people in the primary. 83% of those under 30, Democrats under 30, want alternatives, and about 76% of independents. So I just want to make my case.
When are you going to decide?
I think, well, let me get to my point.
Okay.
So if we don't heed...
I've given you some room.
Yes, you have. If we don't heed that call, shame on us. And the consequences, I believe, are going to be disastrous. So my call is to those who are well-positioned, well-prepared, of good character and competency, they know who they are, to jump in, because Democrats and the country need competition. It makes everything better. That's my call to them right now.
So if they don't, you will?
I'm not saying I will. Look, I think I'm well-positioned to be president of the United States.
You do?
I do not believe I'm well-positioned to run for it right now. People who are should jump in because we need to meet the moment. The moment is now. That is what the country is asking for.
I gave you some running room, so let's tighten up the answers if we can. Can President Biden beat Donald Trump?
I think he can, but I think the only way to determine that objectively is to go through a process. By the way, before it's too late, and I want to tell you this about President Biden, an amazing man. I love the man. He is competent. He is honorable. His integrity, I believe, is unvarnished. He has led this country through extraordinarily difficult times. This is not about him. This is about listening to people. And I'm afraid in this bubble here in Washington, people get real tone deaf real fast, and we should be listening. That's what this is about. It's my call to action.
Assess Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign.
Well, first of all, I like competition. I'm pleased that people...
Is he an adequate competitor?
Not the one that I'm looking for. I don't believe him to be a Democrat.
Is there something telling?
Let me say this.
In what's happened around him?
I think there is something telling. I think he's using a very similar playbook to a former president who did the same in the Republican Party just a little while ago. And I think we should be cautious of that. I also think that's why we need alternatives. I don't believe him to be a Democrat. I do believe, though, that speech is good. More speech is even better. We need alternatives for the massive majority of the middle in America to have some alternatives, too.
Correctly. You don't believe Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a Democrat?
Not from the positions he's been taking, no.
Assess Cornel West. Do you have any anxiety about him running as a Green Party candidate?
I do. Anybody who wants to turn the page and go to the future in this country should be worried about Cornel West's candidacy. Any third-party entrance that would take votes from whoever is going to take on the likely nominee from the GOP, and that's probably Donald Trump. So I would ask Mr. West, I would ask others who are contemplating third-party runs to please think about your legacy, think about the future, and consolidate around entering a Democratic primary, because that's why we have primaries.
I'm confused, Congressman. If there's a conversation that you say needs to occur within the Democratic Party about an alternative to the sitting president of the United States, why isn't the leading contender for that the sitting vice president of the United States, Kamala Harris?
I think we live in an era of fear. What if I get out of line? What if I take on my party? I know the feeling this week.
Is she not qualified?
I think she's absolutely qualified. In fact, I think she's misportrayed. I think everybody in this country should take a little bit of time and sit with people, observe them, know them before you draw conclusions. I think she is more competent and able than many people give her credit for. The job of the vice president is not an easy one.
Would she, in your mind, be the heir apparent if, for some reason, the President of the United States were not to seek the nomination in 2024?
I'm glad you asked the question, and my answer is really simple. Competition. As many people as humanly possible with the talent, the time, the energy, the ethics to enter a primary should do it. We have 12 Republicans as options for Republican primary voters. Right now, we only have 3 on the Democratic side. I believe in competition. We're the Democratic Party. Democracy means the freedom to make choices, and we don't have many of them.
Let me ask you a historical question. You've invoked the names of many Minnesota Democrats. Let me invoke the name of another. Eugene McCarthy ran in 1968 against a well-positioned president with a substantial record of accomplishment for Democratic Party agenda items. He said the reason he had to run was because of the overwhelming issue of Vietnam, that it had to be addressed. Dean Phillips, what's the Vietnam of this election?
The Vietnam of this election, I think everybody knows, and it's about turning the page to the future. That is the Vietnam of right now. That's the quagmire in which we find ourselves. Mr. Hurd, who you just had on the show, if you could see the green room moments ago, the camaraderie between Democrats and Republicans who all want the same thing was represented right there. And I want to remind the American people, that's the Vietnam of right now. The quagmire in which we find ourselves, we will not get out of from a single leader. If everybody takes a pause, starts reaching out their hands to one another again, starts electing and selecting people of competency and good character, we're going to get out of this, and I'm optimistic.
Dean Phillips, Congressman from Minnesota, Democrat. Keep in touch.
Thank you, Major.
We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Up now, CBS News cybersecurity expert and analyst Chris Krebs, who as head of CISA, we'll get into what that means in a second, announced soon after the 2020 election that it was the, quote, most secure election in history. The former president disagreed and memorably, to Chris, fired him. Chris, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Major.
What was the basis of that statement? That it was the most secure election in American history?
So let's contextualize that statement a little bit.
Please.
It was issued on November 12th by a group known as the Election Subsector Joint Coordinating Council. So this was leaders from the federal government, state government, and local government, involved in the administration of elections, alongside those from the private sector and those that support.
Across the country.
Yes. So this was not my statement. This was not CISA's statement.
This is not a red or blue statement.
Correct. This was a bipartisan joint statement by those that are actually involved in the day-to-day administration of elections. And it was their real-time, in-the-moment perspective of what was happening around the United States election at that point. And the important part is that it wasn't just about November 3rd and what immediately preceded and what immediately followed. It was a collective effort really spanning back, from my perspective, back to 2017, that joint effort that we had worked to develop strong partnerships around election security within the federal government, but also with state and local elections.
And as I understand it, President Trump encouraged you to do that very work, did he not?
That we had the full support of the White House, the National Security Council, and those that were immediately within the orbit of the president. In fact, I briefed the vice president, who was on earlier, several times on our election security effort.
What is CISA?
CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It was established by President Trump in 2018, and it is, as Jen Easterly, the current director, calls it, the nation's civilian cyber defense agency.
And at any time when you were briefing either the vice president or the president or senior administration officials about the work you were doing and what it was leading up to in the 2020 election, did they raise any concerns about your ability, your acuity, your trustworthiness, or the trustworthiness of the data you were getting back to you?
We had full support from not just the White House and the executive branch, but also from Congress. We briefed Congress. I personally briefed Will Hurd several times, briefed a range of senators and members of the House of Representatives throughout 2020 on our efforts to secure the 2020 election, and received, as I said, full-throated support.
And when you say security, what does that mean? Does that mean no penetration and that's it? Or does it mean other things under the umbrella of security and secure election?
Well, our efforts starting in 2017 were to work with and establish relationships where we could share information and provide cybersecurity services to state and local election officials so that they could harden their systems and increase the resilience of those systems. And the key takeaway, as I see it, for the 2020 election is that it was effectively the most audited and most papered election in recent history.
Why is that important?
Well, your colleague, David Becker, your co-author, runs the Center for Election and Innovation Research. And he conducted a study that says that in 2016, less than 80% of ballots cast had a paper record associated with it. Paper records are important because you can audit the results. If there are any questions, you can go back, check your math, and ensure the counting was accurate. By the time the 2020 election rolled around, due to combined efforts of federal and state and local election officials, that number increased to around 95% of votes cast, including every one of those close call states. Importantly, Pennsylvania and Georgia both switched systems that had paper ballots associated with the vote, and you could count and recount and audit. In fact, Georgia recounted or audited several times post-November 3rd.
And those systems that do that auditing were secure?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, based on our work with the intelligence community, our understanding of...
And what's from state officials told you? And
Look,
local officials?
Absolutely. Look, I continue to think that there are any number of state election officials that had every incentive in the world to prove that something happened to deliver an outcome to President Trump.
So
but that
with respect,
never happened.
There are those on the Trump side of this ledger who think you might just be a Beltway insider, wise guy, who came to a conclusion and tried to sell it to the president, and just because he didn't believe you, he had a right to do other things. How would you respond to that?
Well, he certainly has the right to claim that he won or, that it was stolen from him. But as we heard, when he takes that action up towards the criminal conspiracy, that's a different matter. But again, our role at CISA was in support of state and local election officials and ensuring that their voices were heard and that the work that they were doing got to the American people to instill and restore confidence in our public institutions.
Were you interviewed by the special counsel?
I was.
Would you appear as a witness?
Of course. Of course.
Do you regard this case as persecution of the former president, politically or otherwise?
Well, it's certainly prosecution, but as for persecution...
His word is persecution.
Yeah, this is going to play out as it plays out. And it's a duly authorized investigation by the Attorney General. It's in the courts now.
What are your concerns? I know you're on the outside now, but I know you keep in close contact with those who are monitoring 2024 about these underlying security and functionality issues.
Well, I think anytime that you put technology systems into a process or into any sort of workflow, there's absolutely the possibility that there are vulnerabilities or misconfigurations that can take place. The key for election systems is you don't have single points of failure, what's known as software independence in this case, where a failure of the hardware or software doesn't result in an undermining of the entire process. And the FBI and CISA continue to say that there's no known capability by an adversary that has been able to change or disrupt the casting, the counting, and the certification of a vote. I continue to have concerns, however, that we are not moving fast enough to get rid of some of these legacy systems and reducing vulnerabilities to stay ahead of what's an intelligent, continually improving adversary.
Very quickly, Chris Krebs, how concerned are you about threats to those who work at the local level on election administration?
Absolutely. As we saw in 22, the threats to election administration officials is off the charts, and it's resulting actually in these officials retiring and leaving the workforce. So we're seeing a sort of voter suppression of another kind, where there may not be enough opportunities to administer the election process, which will cut down on opportunities for people to actually vote.
Chris Krebs, thank you very much for coming in this morning.
Thanks, Major.
We appreciate it. We'll be right back. That does it for today. We thank you for watching. Margaret will be back next week for Face the Nation. I'm Major Garrett, and by the way, I'm not a fan of penalty kicks.